Hey, I'm Dennis Douthit. I'm the lead designer for Conan Exiles.
I'm Chris Meredith. I'm a senior technical designer on Exiles.
Well, it was promised a long time ago. Whenever we first showed off the game, Bill said, "Yeah, there will be sorcery in the game," and that video made its rounds, and people wanted to know more about what would be in the game, and it was early access at the time, so a lot was missing. But honestly, it just boils down to the pure fantasy of Conan, right? Like it's always about a base barbarian defeating a decadent sorcerer. You have to have sorcery to have the decadent sorcerer.
Very abstract at the start. We honestly didn't even know what sorcery was going to be when we first started on it. We knew we wanted utility, but there were just so many questions because in the lore, it's very abstract as well. And what fits in the game doesn't always perfectly line up.
Yeah, from my perspective, going back to the very beginning, essentially our chief creative officer handed me a document and a couple screenshots and said, "This is the design that I had for sorcery that I made 6 years ago." And that's a really good starting point for us, for someone like a creative director to give you his vision for what sorcery would be like. And it was very different from what sorcery wound up being today, but it was the basis for how sorcery ended up. There were times where we would deviate from it, and we always kind of wound up finding our way back to it because the foundation that he gave us was so good. So in the beginning, it was really up in the air. Like a lot of us had ideas for what we thought should be in sorcery. There were a lot of suggestions for things that came from the actual Howard books, things people saw in comics that they wanted. And the way I approached that was I took down all the ideas that the team members had. We had a Slack channel where you would just dump all your ideas for sorcery, no matter what they were. And it was based on the premise: as a sorcerer in my Hyborian age, I want to, dot, dot, dot. And then I took all of those ideas and put them on a post-it notes in Teams. And I had a giant board with a bunch of post-it notes. And I would shuffle these things around and try to categorize them into different schools of magic, and try to cut out the things that don't make sense in the lore of Robert E. Howard. And at the end of the day, we wound up with this giant list of things that people wanted to be able to do as a sorcerer. And at the end of the day, the list was somewhere near 200 spells, I think.
It was very large.
And we had to pare it way back. We just had to keep cutting stuff off that made less and less sense, or things that had overlap. And we had to take all of those nuggets of ideas that everybody wanted to be able to do and distill them into the spells that you received online.
Also, back near the start, we had a lot more spells that were combat focused as well. That was before we decided that sorcery shouldn't actually be that invested in combat. Being a sorcerer is all about preparation, forethought. It's about creating a scenario in which you'll succeed, not finding yourself in a scenario and then somehow magicking your way out of it. That's not how sorcery works. And we had a number of spells that were very combat oriented, very much in the vein of, all right, I'm in combat, there's a guy shooting me, I'm going to summon a wall in front of him. Doesn't really work.
Yeah, especially because there were a few, I guess, directives I established early on. When we found out that a lot of combat, even in the original story, or sorry, a lot of sorcery, even in the original stories, wouldn't be combat oriented. It was really easy to say, okay, sorcery is a means to obtain power. It is not like outright combat damage directly. And there was also a really early focus for things to be ritualistic and slow. So while we were working on deciding how we would cast spells and everything, that played a lot into it, as well as the contents of the spells themselves. Some of the things that we saw really early on, there were a lot of really big asks, and one of them that stood out to me a lot was that one of the developers wanted to see basically sorcery on a scale that was like heaven versus hell, like demons versus angels, and it felt very out of place with Conan. So another thing we had to do in there was consider which of those things really worked within the confines of our lore. In every system that we add in the game, not just sorcery, we tend to try to look at the actual contents that Howard wrote first and think of ways we can pull little tidbits out of it to make the game really unique and stand out, because those stories are something we have that nobody else has. If we can use unique elements of those, to create our gameplay as well, we also have unique gameplay. Yeah. So basically, we took the entire page of sticky notes that everyone had for ideas, and I broke them down into schools of magic. And then we had, from our creative officer, we had a list of things that would be our domains of magic, the schools in which magic would operate. And we could try to figure out which ones of those actually fit into a school and which didn't. So that was like the first cutoff point. If it didn't match any of our actual domains of magic, you're gone.
A lot went in that stage.
And then after that, we kind of had to prioritize them based on usefulness. And a big directive that I gave early on as well was that a spell had to first have a use in PvE, because we know the vast majority of players are going to be using spells in PvE. So if the spell exists, it has a PvE use. And if it has a use in PvP, that's just added incentive.
It was kind of in the collective conscious, but it wasn't being fully adhered to by everyone. So we had some spells like invisibility that originally didn't have, and it was a bit of work to make them actually work in PvP.
Yeah, it's true.
It was that, or we just lose the spell, and we didn't want to lose spells like that.
And then after we had a list of all the spells that actually worked, we had to decide which ones we thought were coolest and we could actually prioritize in. It's easier for us to have a ton of ideas than it is for us to have a ton of time and money. So we have to pick and choose which ones we actually make. So, everyone kind of collectively went through, and I sent out a survey to everyone and had them rank which spells they liked the most. And then I aggregated all the data from which ones people like most, and then put my own, opinion on top of that of which had the most value to the most types of players. And we started to get a list that filled out what we would actually make. And then we took that list and prioritized it based on the most interesting and compelling things. So the things that wound up at the top are the really obvious ones, like the Army of the Dead with the fog and the zombies, the lightning storm, the bat demon, the teleporters. It was all stuff everyone wanted to see for sure. And then, beyond that, we just had a list of things that were really, certain types of player really like seeing this, or certain types of player really like seeing it.
Yeah. It's also worth noting that there was, after we did an implementation and had things in the alpha state, and we were able to play test a bunch of stuff, we looked at a bunch of spells and said, this doesn't work. We thought it would be cool. It's not. We had to go back to the drawing board. And in some cases, some spells actually didn't exist in the form that you see now originally. Army of the Dead used to be 2 separate spells.
That's right.
It used to be Fog and Army of the Dead.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're the same thing. We also had spells that we cut entirely. We had a vertical ice wall. Purpose was to let you climb up things. It wasn't the ice bridge you've got now that goes in an incline. But, we tried it, and it wasn't useful enough. It wasn't fun. It was too clunky, and got replaced with a different concept. The new concept works way better.
Some spells were too good. Like we already had the directive, no combat spells. While the firewall used to deal damage on like a very fast interval, you could pull a bunch of enemies with a thrall and have them all like annihilating your thrall, and cast one firewall on them, and it would just nuke everything in like 2 seconds.
It used to have a very painful heat component, where if you as a player stood next to a firewall, it was very much like standing in lava. Instantly very, very hot. Goodbye health.
Yeah, the play with temperature was a thing that we thought could be interesting, but I don't know if it wound up being as interesting as we thought it would be.
There was an interaction for a while between the ice wall and the lava wall, where their temperatures would fight each other and they would melt.
Mm-hmm.
But
and part of the firewall,
it was too obtuse. It didn't make sense naturally.
Yeah, and part of the firewall, like the idea was that when you're in those really freezing places, like if for some reason your food buff wears off and you're now freezing, you can cast a firewall and have that be like a key source.
Exactly.
Realistically, with the slow ritualistic nature of sorcery,
you would have frozen to death.
It didn't play out very well.